Hey there. Several months ago, I had the idea to make a survey to ask to people on Instagram and YouTube information about their body and the type of board that they most prefer to ride. And my hypothesis was that using this data, I was going to be able to draw some kind of conclusion, make a formula or a chart that can say, if you are this tall, maybe you should ride this kind of wheelbase. Or if you have a shoe size that is this big, you should look for a board with this width. And the reason I use wheelbase instead of length, I explained it in a different video, one of my most popular videos from several years ago, which dimensions matter on your longboard. Length I described in that video as being a little bit arbitrary because every board is going to have a different length. And this length is dictated by the shape, it's dictated by the existence or non-existence of kicktails. Some boards have 2 kicktails, some boards have 1, some downhill boards have no kicktails at all. Some downhill boards don't have kicktails but have an elongated surfboard shape. Some of them are very truncated and are cut off right at the trucks. So wheelbase tells us a lot more about the way a rider interacts with the board dynamically than the length of a board would tell us. So that's why I use that. We can see I asked about shoe size units. What is your shoe size? How tall are you? What is your preferred deck width? And what is your preferred wheelbase? And I want you to ignore this down here, is rail match ideal? That was more of a, I don't know, just a fun data point for me to mess with and read in my own time. We're not going to be getting into that today. I actually do have a different video about rail match, explaining it and debating whether or not it is useful. So stay tuned for that, but that's not a topic for today. So we can see our data here. These are all the responses I got. And there is a lot here. People gave ranges, people gave descriptions, people explained themselves, because I feel like this taught me something, is that when you ask somebody for a yes or no answer, or you ask somebody for a number, and this yes or no answer or this number is related to their preference, humans seem to have some reason to not want to be black and white about things. They don't want to be, very finite and give one data point. They like the gray area. They want to explain themselves. And so I can respect that. I understand that everything in life has gray areas, but it did not translate well to data. So I had to extrapolate on all of these. And I manually went through all of these, not only fixing things like, somebody is typing out 6'3". That's not a number I can turn into a data point. Somebody is explaining that they wear a smaller shoe size when they're skateboarding. These things are fine. It's just not data I can turn into. I had to comb through all of this. It didn't take very long because there are 76 total responses to this poll. Some of these answers don't actually have any meaning. So the truth is that I had to throw out some of these. I didn't throw out based on any kind of bias of like, oh, you're too big, oh, the board is too strange, or your submission is weird. I threw out data points when there actually wasn't anything. Like for this example, your preferred deck width doesn't matter as long as the wheelbase is right. Real world, I totally respect that. Had to throw it out in order to extract data. So here's what we got. We've got our cleaned up form responses. I converted shoe size into US units. I converted height into inches. I converted width into inches and wheelbase into inches, with some highlighted red things that were just markers for me of like, okay, make sure I don't include this in my particular data set. So let's look at the first thing, finally get into the data here. What is your shoe size and what is your preferred deck width? We can see shoe size is on the x-axis here and the width of your board is on the y-axis. So if my theory is correct that I can recommend somebody a width based on their shoe size, that would indicate that there is a positive correlation, a positive relationship between these two things. And we should see a trend line that as people's feet get bigger, their width also tends to get bigger. And technically we see that, but this calculated trend line here has such a small slope. And the slope of this is 0.03, 0.0313. And that is, what is that? Inches over shoe size. That's basically representing how we would convert. If I were to make an equation to calculate this for people, this would be the relationship between the two. And the fact that it's such a small number indicates to me that there's really not a strong correlation between your shoe size and the width of your board. We're talking about 0.03 inches for every number that your shoe size goes up. So for every 1 unit increase in shoe size, we would add 0.03 inches to the width of your board. And with so few data points, we're only looking at 73 good data points here. I can't draw any strong correlation from this data. And the fact that this graph even has a positive slope in its trend line could just be a fluke. If one person, a 74th person, submitted a response that, countered this trend line, then I don't know, it could very well switch to negative. It could be less strong. Now there is an interesting data point up here. Somebody prefers an 11-inch width board. That maybe I could throw out, and maybe it would make the trend line a little bit stronger. And in fact, I did do this, and I think it brought the data point from, or the slope from 0.3 to 0.4. So not a significant change when we throw out that data point. And I don't want to throw it out either, because this person could be rocking an old school board. Some boards did. Valhalla had a board that had a maximum width of 10.75 inches, I believe. I think the Black Dolphin. But the interesting thing about that width is that the width is only contained in the center. There are so many arguments of why any single data point may or may not be true, may or may not be an accurate representation, but there's, something about it that in large enough numbers, all these edge cases, in my opinion, might cancel each other out. So, unfortunately, this scattering of data here does not represent a strong enough trend for me to say anything confident about how the width of your board should relate to your shoe size. Maybe that makes you breathe a sigh of relief. Maybe it means that, I can experiment with any width and there's not a right answer or an average answer. In fact, when I calculate the average, it says that an average width of the boards from submitted results is 9 inches. And, that's a little bit over this 8.73, basically 8.73 based on this data, which is not incredible data, not really strong correlating data. 8.75 is maybe the smallest board that you should and would consider. As, let's say, your starting board, your first board, but the average board that people are riding is 9.04. So unfortunately, no information we can draw here other than it's arbitrary and ride what you like. So let's move on to height and length. Unfortunately, we see a pretty similar trend of the data is very scattered and the trend line is really close to flat. And the interesting thing in this case is that the trend line is actually negative. It means that as you get taller, you tend to prefer a smaller wheelbase, which doesn't line up with my intuitions, and frankly, I don't think has any real-world explanation. The trend line here is not actually useful because it's not representing a significant correlation in the data. In fact, the only way that you could say this trend line is useful is to say that there is no correlation in the data. It is random. So once again, the height of a person cannot, or at least right now, does not prescribe how long of a wheelbase you should be riding. This trend line is almost flat, which you can see on the graph, and that is represented by how small this number is. Scientific notation, if you're not familiar, is the number in front times 10 to this power. So 10 to the negative third. So we're looking at 9.68 times 10 to the negative third would represent 0.00968, which is basically 0.01. Not a strong correlation. But if we're going to try to extract some information out of this, there's not very much we can draw. We can say that 22.1 might be the smallest wheelbase you would want to consider for your first board, and then start experimenting from there. And because of this trend line, I'm assuming 22.1 is going to be extremely close to our average. So let's do that formula real quick. Average of column B is going to be, 21.44. That is the average wheelbase people are riding that responded to this survey right now. So if you're looking for the perfectly average board to get you started, to set a baseline of this is the average board that people are riding, you're going to want to look for something 9 inches wide with a 21.5-inch wheelbase. And frankly, that is not very hard to find. There are a decent amount of manufacturers out there that have decks with that specific size, which is pretty interesting. So I'm not saying that you need to go buy a board this size as your first board. Really, what I'm saying is there is no mathematical correlation between your shoe size and the width of your board. There's no mathematical correlation between your height and the length of your wheelbase. The only data I've gotten from this is the average. This is on average what people are riding. And I think even if it's not helpful, I think there's a certain beauty in the fact that you can't look at somebody and know what kind of board they will want to ride. It is that random. And yeah, there's a beauty in that. So let me know if you found this information interesting. I'm looking for more ways in the future to kind of bring data into our analysis of figuring out what the right board is for you. And the interesting takeaway from this is that finding out what board is right for you is way more about your own preference, way more about your own feelings and the way you connect with a setup than it is anything intrinsic about your own physicality, anything intrinsic about the dynamic relationship between you and your board. It is what it is. And what it is a whole lot of nothing. So have fun skating. Don't sweat too much about the perfect width of a board or the perfect wheelbase for your board, because on average, it doesn't really matter and it doesn't relate to anything about your body. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.